months, India will be the most populous country on planet Earth. Over the next many years, India is going to add 1 million people to its working age population every month. At this rate, we need a Mindtree every day and a TCS every month to keep our people gainfully, meaningfully employed. Add to this the disruption and the productivity revolution that generative AI technologies like ChatGPT or let's say GitHub Copilot have created. As I keep saying, AI is not going to replace human beings, but human beings that use AI will outperform and potentially replace human beings that don't use AI. Lawyers that use AI are going to outperform lawyers that don't use AI. Radiologists that use AI are going to replace or outperform radiologists that don't use AI. Given this kind of a situation, right, what do we have? This is a disruptive moment and yet a very scary and very exciting moment. What do we have going for India? India has been there before. We have, at one point of time, been quarter of the world's GDP. If you look at the startup ecosystem and the deep tech ecosystem, it's thriving. VC and PE investments in India are going up by leaps and bounds. India is already the number 3 in the world in terms of R&D publications in research fields like AI. So we have some things good going for us, but what will keep this momentum going? What will it take for us to get to the top 10 as global innovative countries in the world? To discuss with us, we have an impressive panel here. Very few people in the world change the world in meaningful ways. We have 2 people who have done that here with me today. We have Ashish Dhawan, who co-founded Chris Capital in 1999 and then transitioned into a philanthropist and in the journey founded Ashoka University as well. And we have Sabeer Bhatia, who co-invented Hotmail in 1996, and his transaction with Microsoft was that high watermark moment for .com euphoria, and then he's changed the world in meaningful ways after that as well. So thank you, welcome Sabeer and Ashish to this panel. I have very simple questions for you. The answers may be difficult, but the questions are very simple. So as we think about innovation in India and what it takes to get India onto the top 10 most innovative countries, my first question to you is, what is working today for India? Ashish, maybe with you?
Yeah, I think the natural response to this in terms of what is working is that we have a vibrant startup ecosystem. We have a wonderful IT services BPO industry that's growing and is envy of the world, and that is true. But I would argue that in terms of innovation, there are 3 areas where innovation is having a deep impact on India that's actually greater than what we normally talk about. And that is the impact on inclusion, the impact on jobs, and the impact on exports. So the startup ecosystem, there's a lot of hoopla noise. I think it's obviously unleashed a lot of entrepreneurial energy, which will have a lot of positive benefits in the next couple of decades. But at net, it's only created about 1 million plus jobs. IT BPO has created maybe 4.5 million jobs. I know there are indirect jobs with every one of these jobs. Maybe it's a 3 multiplier or something like that. But let's switch to where innovation is really working now at massive scale, much larger, which is really using our prowess in tech for our own benefit in India. So for inclusion, if you look at DBT alone, right, this year there are 34 Government of India schemes that use DBT, and 5.5 lakh crore will be given out much more efficiently than before, probably 3 to 4x more efficiently than the past. But I think what I'm seeing now is beyond that, much more money is spent. You know, there's a small amount spent on subsidies that really goes through the DBT pipe. But really it's about how can government serve its citizens, bottom half in particular, 700 million people, and that's where innovation can really make a difference. And people like Nandan have been working on it, but in terms of whether it's tech for, in the case of affordable healthcare, education, but also making government work more effectively. Service delivery by government itself to the last mile. So that's one area. Second area is jobs. I mean, I think a lot of people are excited about, you know, UPI And UPI essentially reduces the friction costs, makes it much easier. But UPI fundamentally doesn't create too many additional jobs. I think the big thing that we're really going to see now is with data being available, particularly GST data, other forms of data, the account aggregator model, is really credit to SME. That the innovation with the platforms we built, with the India stack, is really going to unleash a wave of job creation. SMEs in India employ 110 million people. There's 60 million of them. And they're credit starved. And the fact that we can get credit to them for the first time in a meaningful way, I think is a real game changer. And this is a real innovation. It's deep innovation in terms of the impact that it'll have in terms of creating jobs. And that's what India needs over the next 10 years. And the third is from an export standpoint, which is, I mean, clearly what COVID has showed us that there are services beyond IT, BPO, traditionally that we think of that are exportable. So that services pie is going to expand. Some innovation has started, but much more can be done. But even on the manufacturing side, I think there's some innovation in terms of how you aggregate orders, how you quality assure suppliers, etc. And particularly in areas like electronics, garments, India needs to win the game. There are 50 million jobs for the taking from China. Every one of those jobs will create another 1.5 to 2 indirect jobs. So how we can apply innovation to win that game around manufactured goods, particularly labor-intensive exports, these, in my mind, are the game changer. Because what India needs is the next 100 million, 150 million jobs, and we need it to be one that really goes deep, and not just the 1, 2, 3 million jobs at the top end.
Yeah, thank you. And in fact, I do see a lot of focus these days on both ease of living and ease of doing business in India, which that focus, like you rightly said, can really expand the economy and create innovation. Sabeer, as you see it from more a US to India perspective, as you see from a little bit of a distance, what do you see working for India at this point of time from an innovation standpoint?
I have a very contrarian view to people who are living within the country and getting fed a lot of information about all of the positive things happening over here. My view is that trying to make in India is an outdated story. Mm-hmm. You cannot make anything in India anymore because first, that was a story of the 1980s and China already, latched on to it. And even if we are successful in attracting the world's manufacturing to India, if you look at the modern Tesla factory, the newer factories, they just employ 300-400 people. So even if we were able to get all the world's manufacturing, we would have only about 100,000 more jobs that we would create over here, if at all. My view is that we are headed into a creative economy. India, by the way, I think is very unprepared for it as of this time because of the system of education. It doesn't allow for creative thinking. It doesn't encourage out-of-box thinking. However, I think I have a solution to creating the next 50, 60 million jobs. And that is to fund 1 million crazy ideas. Let the youth of this country think of absolutely out-of-box ideas. Let them imagine the future. Yeah. Fund them. 90% of them will fail. But the 10% that make it will create 20, 30, 40 trillion dollars of value. When I look at Silicon Valley, none of the ideas in the last 30 years that have created 30, 40 trillion dollars of value, of wealth, were normal ideas, run-of-the-mill, where a government or smart people like us are telling people we should do this, we should do that. No. I mean, that is like hand-holding. Let them create their own jobs. Let them find local problems to solve. Every one of the companies, whether it is Google or Uber or Stripe, Airbnb, even Hotmail, Yahoo, every one of them was an innovative idea that didn't exist before. We need to find those ideas and encourage them. The problem is, at least from the outside, 90% of India's innovation industry and the whole energy is copycat ideas. Already been done before. There's nothing new. We have to encourage original thinking, and that starts from kindergarten. We're a little, of course, it'll take many decades for us to change our thinking, but for the time being, I have another solution for that. I'm trying to make a television show that teaches people the basics of entrepreneurship in an entertaining fashion. So at least they get a flavor, something more than just Shark Tank. Shark Tank is just the deal portion. And if I'm successful, I'm hoping to create 50 million new jobs in the next 20 years.
Fantastic. So you're already on to solutions, which was going to be my third question. But before we go to the solutions, maybe let's also discuss what's not working. Ashish, you talked about the rosy part of this, but what is India not doing right now, which we must immediately address?
Yeah. See, where I disagree with Sabeer is this fancy stuff is all great, but we are $2,500 per capita income looking to go to $10,000 per capita income. Industries like garments and electronics, the assembly part is not going to get disintermediated and robotized anytime in the next 10, 15, 20 years. It'll gradually happen. You got to ride the escalator while it's running. You at the next store when you will be at the next floor when it stops running. I mean, China has innovated in terms of garment manufacturing. For every $1 billion still, it employs 150,000 people. None of your fancy industries can create 150,000 people in one small unit, okay? So this is available. We've got to keep this in mind. That's where I'm coming from. We need a policy that suits our country, not the Western world. In terms of where we have failed or where we really need to look ahead, if you again look at the history of countries that get into lower middle income, they need to start now making investments in R&D today to reap the benefits 15, 20 years later, because they'll have to break out of middle income 15, 20 years later. And I think India is in grave danger of missing that bus if we don't make those investments now. So if you look at R&D as a percent of GDP, it's only 0.7%. Out of that, government is 0.45%. The corporate sector is 0.25%. That is abysmally low. And Korea, if you look at its development, and that started really in the late 60s and 70s, when they got into lower middle income, over the course of 30 years, Korean corporate R&D went up 1,000 times, right? 1,000 times. They really invested in R&D, and that's why Lucky Gold Star, which is a shitty brand, eventually became LG, and eventually became a global leader across multiple products and down the value chain as well. So I think we need to make those investments now for the future, and R&D really needs to go up. You need a concerted strategy also, and we'll talk about it in solutions, and I don't think we have a coherent industrial policy to support that. China, for instance, is winning, for instance, in EVs right now, but the seeds of this were laid 20 years ago, and they had a very coherent strategy over this period of time, whether it is looking at subsidies. There have been over $30 billion of subsidies in that industry, particularly the last 12, 13 years. Whether it is looking at procurement, Shenzhen started procuring electric buses, which allowed BYD and others to generate some revenue early on, and government vehicles and things like that. Whether it is R&D that they subsidized and made available, whether it is procuring materials and the supply chain, it was a coherent strategy to actually win. And I don't still see that coherent strategy to win in these industries over the next 15, 20 years. So I think that's what we're missing. We obviously don't have deep science. So take something like bioscience. India's done well in chemistry. Our pharmaceutical industry is stuck with generics. I mean, you look at the innovation in bioscience and look at what's likely to happen in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Sabeer is talking about disruption. There I agree with him, that if we don't invest in life science, bioscience today, or deep tech, we run the risk of getting disrupted and not having a seat at the table where future jobs are going to get created.
Sabeer, I know you have a strongly critical view of where we are as an industry, and I know you talked a lot about how the entire tech industry could be disrupted. So from your lens, what is India missing right now? What's not working as far as India is concerned? Maybe a little deeper into that.
Well, you have to look at what India's greatest asset is. India's greatest asset is its people.
Yeah.
Till today, every policy or initiative doesn't look at it that way. I mean, it's more of a still a zero-sum game kind of play where you're not allowed to experiment with new ideas. It begins with the culture too.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was in India, I was the only one who would raise my hand and ask questions. And the teacher would say, just keep quiet, just take these notes because it'll help you in the exam. So the purpose of education was to get the highest marks in an exam, to go to college, an engineering college, and graduate and get a job. Until today, we create cram masters, the world's best. That's useless. In the modern context, it is completely useless. Culturally, we have to encourage our kids to learn, not to study and regurgitate. And I think innovation comes from asking basic questions. If you don't change your education to becoming an inquiry-based system of education and keep it a knowledge-based system of education, you're doomed. There is no future. I mean, we will, for 100 years down the road, still be doing menial jobs. However, I mean, look at the United States. Yeah, it is far more educated than we are, but 90% of jobs are created by small businesses. Why do we not encourage the small business sector? China grew not because it invested heavily in R&D, it's doing that now, but there were millions of Chinese from the US who went back, did foreign direct investment and started manufacturing units in China 20 years ago. Well, Indians are not very good at manufacturing, but we've got to encourage people to come up with original ideas and that solve local problems, community problems. It could be in a village. So it has to be decentralized decision-making and decentralized growth. There cannot be a central planned growth model. That does not work. It has to be at the grassroots level. And right now, the opportunity is phenomenal. There are 400 million youth in this country, all of whom want to do a startup, all of whom want to work at a startup. I think if we can channel that energy by appropriately guiding it, we have a great shot at becoming a top 5 economy in the next 20 years.
So maybe I'll ask you to put yourself in the shoes of, let's say, the government or the Prime Minister or the tech industry and or the people in this audience. What must we do differently today to ensure that India is in the top 10 most innovative countries, both in the very short term, and when you think of countries, short term means 5 to 7 years, and in the very long term, let's say next 10 to 50 years, what do we need to do differently as of today to ensure that future? I know you've talked about some of those. Maybe if you could elaborate on some of those themes, and then we can go to Ashish after that.
Encourage questioning, encourage out-of-box thinking, encourage absolutely crazy ideas.
How does the Prime Minister do that for the whole country? It's not that easy, the way you framed it. But what do we need to, from a policy standpoint, from investment standpoint, from what do they have to do?
Surprisingly, from the investment, not a whole lot. But from a policy standpoint, don't put a startup in the same box as a regular company.
Yeah.
Most startups that I know that have been super successful didn't make any money for the first 6 to 10 years. They either built user bases in the consumer space, or they, like Tesla, just was tinkering around with a new kind of idea for a car. Out-of-box thinking. Yeah. In 2014, I'll give you an interesting anecdote. You know, Ford CEO went to the board and said, this is the best quarter in the history of Ford ever. You know, more profit than ever. One of the board members asked him a question. What is your view of electric vehicles? And Tesla was very tiny at that point. He says, well, we think it's a niche market. He was told to leave the room, and by the time he came back, he lost his job. He was fired. Now imagine, could that kind of thinking, you know, be replicated in any board in India? No, we're all about making money, but that's irrelevant. It comes. First step should be to solve a problem. The money follows. That change in thinking has to come at all levels. You know, government, industry, companies, board, families, everything. We are still, as a country, living in the past. We're not living in the future. We're not even imagining the future. I think that's the cultural change that has to occur.
I was in a discussion where the Prime Minister was addressing the country post the budget yesterday, and I saw that orientation that, yes, it has to become easier for businesses, it has to become easier for people to live. Therefore, what are the changes the country is making, let's say, to make sure that businesses can start easily, shut down easily, the creative destruction in the economy? I think that awareness is very high. So my question is, from awareness to action, what do we need to do in terms of action? The awareness is all over. I can see this room, or when in all the government circles, all the secretaries, I see a very big change in the thinking. But my question is, from awareness into action, what are something concrete we can do?
Yeah, so I think firstly, I would look at, if we want to move up the value chain over the next 10, 15 years, R&D needs to go from 0.7% of GDP to 2.5% of GDP over the next 15 years. Government will play some role. That 0.45% probably needs to go to 0.7% or 0.75%. But really, it's a question of how do you crowd in private investment. From a government investment standpoint, it needs to focus on maybe 10 missions. You know, what are 10 areas? So you concentrate your bets that are futuristic. We need to make sure ease of doing science improves. Science, it's not easy to do science. It's bureaucratic if you're a scientist at a government-run institution. And we need to prioritize more money going to universities versus small R&D labs. So I think that will get basic science or even applied science going. But more importantly, connect them with industry. I think there is a complete disconnect between industry and academia, R&D labs in India, and you need to create the right incentives. Maybe in the near term, government even needs to put up 1 rupee for every rupee that industry invests in an R&D project with an IIT lab. Government puts up 1 rupee initially. Because there is skepticism, there's disbelief, make sure the outputs are clearly defined. Maybe there's an intermediary required to make sure that the faculty are pushed to deliver. But we need to forge this. We cannot say that this is not going to work, that during COVID, if we wanted a solution, someone has to go to an American, Baylor or someone to get it solved. These things have to work in India. So those policies, those incentives need to be created. And then from an industry standpoint, I know we've had tax breaks and stuff in the past, but the right sector-linked incentives so that R&D actually does go up from 0.25% to maybe 1.75% of GDP in the next 15 years. So I think this big sort of push in terms of industrial policy, in terms of what we're doing with research. I mean, one idea was this National Research Foundation, which is the equivalent of the NSF, which India was supposed to create, which has gotten delayed. I think it's a critical reform, because if you have research money being driven by departments, DBT, DST, etc., it's very siloed, versus a National Research Foundation with a different governance model. So those are the kinds of things I think that need to happen if we really want to move on. The startup ecosystem by itself can't do it. I mean, America made this happen not just because of the startup ecosystem. You had NSF and NIH, you had a university ecosystem, that could then propagate out into the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and that collaboration is what drove innovation in America. And I think the same needs to happen in India in the next 15 years.
How about deep science and deep tech? Of course, there's a very thriving deep tech ecosystem, but you also spoke about deep science. What does one need to do differently to accelerate? Because there is a convergence between deep science and deep tech. For example, I mean, we all talked about ChatGPT as a big defining moment in AI in 2022, but in my opinion, the bigger defining moment was possibly July 31st, 2022, when DeepMind released AlphaFold 2, where they basically gave you the three-dimensional structure of 200 million proteins. So if you can use AI to do this kind of work, by the way, to decode even a single protein molecule's 3D structure, it would take a PhD, PhD student, one full PhD to uncover that. Now, in one strike, they did 200 million of them. So the deep science and deep tech are coming together. So what does one have to do to encourage that sort of innovation coming not just from the Western world, but from India as well?
See, I think we've ignored science because of engineering gaining such huge prominence in India. So basic science has been ignored completely. If you were good at science in school, if you loved physics, you were pushed into into engineering. And I think the pendulum needs to swing back. Nothing wrong with engineering. But I think, bioscience is clearly a future science. And you can be as good as you are with, computer science, but it's at the intersection of computer science and natural science, whether it's computational neuroscience or whether it's computational biology, where a lot of innovation is going to take place. So I think India needs more investment in, if you think of, clearly for engineering, everybody knows IIT is the best place. But when you think of what's the best place in India for bioscience, it's not clear. Maybe, Indian Institute of Science is good, maybe NCBS is good, but there's no real good place in India. So I do think it's important to invest in basic science and more importantly in these interdisciplinary programs at the intersection of computation and basic science.
Okay, if my mic is working, I don't need this. So yeah, you asked that question, what should the government do? I have a crazy idea.
Please.
Yeah.
We
I
need crazy
live
ideas.
on crazy ideas. For the longest time, the Indian government tried these special economic zones, which were physical places which had different laws and different rules. How about doing a special economic zone in the cloud, where every startup in the cloud has different rules, of formation, of closure, of operation, of maintaining balances, of GST requirements. I think we will at least make a huge step in the virtual world and make it so much easier for people to test their ideas. See, startups are built on ideas, and the whole Silicon Valley ecosystem is built on 9 out of 10 failing. The problem is, culturally, we don't think we have failed. We think we want to be successful. That's one, desirous of being successful is one thing, but accept failure if it truly has not worked. We have to culturally embrace that. It should be a badge of honor that you have been through 3 or 4 or 5 failed startups. Everything is, so-and-so is doing so well. That means everything is equated to money. Person is making money, great. Not somebody who has tried something so crazy that if it did work, it would change the world. Culturally, our emphasis is on the wrong number. And I think one simple idea to change that is to create some sort of a virtual special economic zone where startups can be incubated, formed, and can be shut down just as easily.
Understood. No, that's a powerful idea. With that, maybe we'll take one audience question each for Sabeer and Ashish. Anyone with a question? Anyone who has a question for the audience? From the audience? Okay, there. Can we get a mic for him, please?
Thank you, guys. My question to you is that we have learnt a lot in terms of what has not gone right and what India is lacking in terms of doing it. We haven't got enough to hear in terms of why is it that with our education system, the CEOs of so many American companies are Indians. Why is it that we have been successful and people like you are world over well-known personalities with the educational background and with what we have? Please, if you could give us what's right about India.
Sure. I mean, very simple answer to a complex question. I was not the smartest person at my university, BITS Pilani. I went to Caltech. I went to Stanford. I just got lucky. But the point is, the system in the US is so phenomenally great that everybody succeeds. The system here is broken, so we need to fix the system. It's not the people. We're not, I know half the CEOs of all of the Silicon Valley companies that are great. I mean, they're all fantastic. They didn't start them. They're all fantastic at management. They rose up. They are managing them very well. But we are talking about creating from scratch. And we still, our education system is still not hands-on. I'll give you another example. Just last week, my 6-year-old and 8-year-old were partaking in a Pinewood Derby. They had to design a car that would compete with 65 other cars. They got a block of wood. I did not know what to do with it. I didn't know how to design a car. And I've gone to Caltech and Stanford. Yet they learned it. I looked at some YouTube videos and I saw that first you had to make a very aerodynamic car. Second, you had to place the wheels at the right position to have the lowest center of gravity, and that's what gave you the best chance of winning. Now, this kind of concept is being taught to a 6-year-old in America. Which 6-year-old in India does that? We've already lost. That is the problem, that our education system is stuck in the past. And no amount of, sorry to you, but no amount of money can change that. We have to change it from the very grassroots. Create a hunger for learning, not for getting marks, getting an engineering degree, and then getting a job. That cannot be the path anymore.
Ashish?
Yeah, so I don't think all is broken. I think education firstly is broken for the bottom half more than anybody else. They don't even get to read, so forget about all this other stuff. I think what the Indian education does is it's competitive. And because it's competitive, I think it makes people very competitive. And also there's a certain resilience you learn growing up in a less developed place. Those are huge strengths. I think there's some element of rote which is also probably good. What it doesn't offer is a sort of opening up of the mind, allowing you to tinker. I don't know whether you have to do it at age 6, or whether if you did some of it a little bit later, you could still make it happen. My sense is one of the reasons people did so well even going abroad is they have that competitive streak. They have resilience, but also they became broader thinkers as they were exposed to the US, because the US, makes you more of a well-rounded, liberal arts, interdisciplinary kind of person. So my own feeling is it doesn't necessarily need to happen. Of course, given the scale of our system, I don't think you'll be able to do it in primary education. There are more basic things to solve there. But I do think at later stages, and this is why the government has these tinkering labs and things that they put in place, lots more can be done there. But I think it could still happen in high school and in college, where we could build more of the mindset that Sabeer is talking about.
What I gather from the conversation so far is that India's greatest gift is its human capital. And yet, the biggest challenge that we have is that we are not nurturing this human capital in a significant way. Think of primary education is a case in point, because I think if we have failed in one place significantly, it is in that realm, because we still have teacher absenteeism, we still have students dropping out every year, etc. So if we can make the right investments in making sure that, first of all, quality education is there. Secondly, it's not about finding answers, but asking the right questions, creative problem solving, the human things like empathy and creativity and learning to learn. If we inculcate these sorts of things in our people, we may not get significant results in the first 5 years, but very sure we're going to get those results in the next 50 years. So with that, thank you again, Ashish and Sabeer, for an enlightening conversation. It was wonderful to have you here. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Srikanth. I'm going to request.
For more interesting content, like, comment and subscribe to our NASSCOM YouTube channel.